I study stories as a sociologist and specifically as a criminologist. There's a vast literature on stories and what they're made of and what they do in society. Well, we know that stories are shaped by cultures and how stories fall into genres. People may probably already have a sense about that, the horror genre or the romantic comedy, and notice how similar they are within the genres. If I ask you to tell a life story, it's very normative in our culture. It's very much expected for you to tell a story that goes up, that is positive. It's not so common, it's not crazy, but it's not so common to just tell a story that is of decline. So we call that a progressive narrative. The stories that are typical in American society nowadays tend to emphasize individual actors and individual actions. They tend to ignore the patterns that affect people's lives, like the availability of affordable housing, like health care that's affordable or publicly provided, like child care policies, the availability of jobs. The most famous model for telling a story in America is that somebody coming from a very disadvantaged background, beating the odds, succeeding no matter what. And we love that kind of story. I love that kind of story. But what happens is that kind of story, which emphasizes hard work and the strong character of the protagonist, it has a tendency to occlude the circumstances people are experiencing, to keep those, marginalized. And another thing, it tends to get us thinking that anyone who doesn't make it must not have worked especially hard, must not have strong character. So what would be the implications of that? Well, we shouldn't help them. They don't deserve it. They wouldn't make good use of that help anyway. It's hard to tell a different story in our cultural environment. But that's a big part of what the sociological imagination is about. We think of sociological imagination as being able to tell a biography that includes the shaping effect of all the contexts within which people live, including history, including social policies, including the culture in which you live, and your position in the world.
I grew up in a poor rural community. My family were very much working class. We spent most of our time with family and in the community of faith that we were a part of. And those were the two main influences in my life. I was writing books in notepads by the time I was 4 and 5 years old. Writing was always super important to me. I looked for ways to do work like that at home, and my mom actually was very supportive and developed projects for me. And they did do things a little bit differently than a lot of their family before them, which was they were, supportive of things I was trying to do in school. There were definite privileges I had growing up in schools that were fairly well resourced, but also could guide me toward the next kinds of steps. And that was really important in all along in terms of the steps that got me here. My dad comes from kind of a complicated history. He was born in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, along with my grandfather and my great-grandfather. Tahlequah is the home to Cherokee Nation, which is one of the few sovereign tribes in the United States. A lot of folks who were native and indigenous in Tahlequah did a westward migration at a particular point, and he and my grandfather and grandmother moved to California at a certain point to do various forms of labor. So they were part of logging labor in Northern California, and eventually my grandfather worked and retired in the San Joaquin Valley. And I spent my summers there, so it was a real factor in terms of how, I at least got out of the region I grew up in and went to school in to see other kinds of things. My mom and dad met through our church, and they met at camp meetings in Colorado. My dad had to leave and go to Vietnam soon after, and when he got back, he and my mom got married. There was a mobility step. My dad became a salesman. I remember him getting up every day, wearing a suit and tie. And my mom was home. We had 3 meals, and that was kind of our lifestyle. So there was a kind of mobility there that then bumped me into yet another level of it, with where I am now, kind of solidly middle class. I think that being working class and growing up with that kind of class background sensitized me to a lot of different kinds of struggles that we face. You know, it was also me watching their life and their labor be extracted in particular kinds of ways. So thinking about the constraints that they faced and in terms of their own life and their own creativity, and knowing I wanted something that would allow for that. It took a while longer for me to realize exactly how much a part of my life race was, because I grew up in a white world. You know, there were no people of color in my schools, in my religion and community of faith, and in my family. So it was only at college when I met someone who was assigned to a work-study position with me. And we got to know each other, and in the process became really good friends, and have been through a lot across the years together. You know, I took her home one weekend to be with my family, and one of my young cousins was playing with her, and just in the course of play, called her the most racially charged term in American history, and did it in front of everyone. We were at a family gathering.
I'm originally from Mississippi, single mother household. My grandmother did a lot of the raising as far as my childhood is concerned. I seen her work as a maid servant for a white family in Mississippi, and part of that was really instrumental of really pushing me to think about the world in more complex ways. And so it was that interaction, thinking about the inequalities that we had to endure growing up. I grew up extremely poor, project housing, asking the question, to be honest with you, as a child, why me? Like, why did we have to grow up in this way? Especially in school, I was, you know, relatively okay as far as academics are concerned. But when I see my friends who were not passing to the next grade, who were not getting good grades in class, will still come to school in the best clothes and the best shoes, and it made me feel some kind of way. And so I took it personal. I thought my family just didn't care about me in the same way other people's families cared about them. I really took it personal growing up poor, that my family was doing something individually, and I internalized that. I thought that was part of my biography. I thought that my family didn't want to succeed, especially when you hear narratives in, you know, in the media, on the news, that, you know, people who look like me are lazy and not hardworking. And so I really, really took that personal and thought my family actually fit the bill. And it created a sense of frustration, depression, just wanting to escape in any way possible. So, you know, part of that biography is also internalizing a lot of that, from drugs to, you know, smoking weed with my friends growing up in high school. I ended up having a baby when I was 15 years old. All of those things were part of my biography and the frustrations that I felt. And so part of me getting here is to really understand, why was it me? Why did I have to grow up like that?
I went to a high school that was the first integrated high school really in the south side of Chicago, which was not embroiled in violence around integration at the time. Here I was this young kid who was interpreted by my teachers as a troubled, white, middle-class kid. And I became involved in drugs very, very early, at the expense of any interest in school. It didn't hurt that my mother was also, for a period of the time, the president of the PTA and active in school. So I would miss classes for 8 weeks at a time. And instead of being kicked out of class, like many of the black kids with the same skills, lack of skills, bad habits that I had would have resulted in, but instead those teachers came to talk to my mom. And so the family expectations pushed me through. All of my siblings, I have 3 siblings, all of us ended up with advanced degrees. I was the only one who took the deviation, the diversion, but all of us went ahead in that same way. I graduated from a high school. Only 2/3 of those kids that I went in with graduated in 4 years. But because of that understanding of me as a particular member of a group, white, middle class, even troubled, I was pushed on through. When I got to college, those bad habits, as I said, continued to follow me. As I was dropping out, I went to work on construction sites. In the construction world, where there wasn't a whole lot of place for excuses, I learned how to work very, very hard, and I learned about low pay, hard work, and a very different class existence, a working class existence, as opposed to the middle class existence that I came up in. I had to move to Aspen, Colorado to work for very rich people, but the knowledge about groups continued. I became part of an army of workers who called ourselves the Down Valley Dirtbags, because we lived down valley from Aspen because we couldn't afford to live there.
You know, the response of my family, it was a turning point for me. I was like, how can this happen? And of course, Jill, my friend, she was like, this happens every day. So this was nothing new for her. But we made that journey, and she was patient with me through it together. But I do think, thinking about the absences that structure our lives are equally important in thinking about who we are, who we want to be, and what we want to seek out. And those contradictions, they materialize across a lifetime. This is how race impacts our lives, even when we see it as non-racial. It's a space in which constantly we are creating racial hierarchies that are deadly, and racial hierarchies that are profoundly damaging. And those hierarchies come through how we raise our children and how we educate them and the things we tell them and the things they hear. And it comes also through, not seeking out or learning about other people's experiences and moving toward that in particular ways as opposed to moving away from it. I lived in a very insular community, both of faith and family. And that's really important, and it's one of the things, here at UT I'm very committed to, is the idea that we have experiences beyond our own with other people different from us. So, one of the things I would say is that both patriarchy and the class struggle and different things added up at a certain point to really, really hard times for my family. When my mom was diagnosed with a late form of breast cancer, there was no history in our religion of using healthcare or medicine. It was prohibited along with other things that were fairly gendered. And she made a decision to pursue that. She felt clear in her faith to do that. But it resulted in her basically being, kicked out of the church. She was uninsured. The medical bills added up. My family filed bankruptcy. They lost the house. My parents, after 30 years of marriage, divorced. And eventually my mom passed. And my father's story is equally challenging. He had 3 other siblings. All of them died prematurely from alcohol and substance abuse, as well as suicide. Those kinds of deaths are what Jonathan Metzl calls deaths of despair. They're linked to whiteness. They're also linked to the way my great-grandfather died at Cherokee Nation. There's lots of connections here that are structural and extend across generations. And I think all of that's played a really important role in where I am and why I'm here and why I've stayed here, because alone as an individual, it's hard to make sense of that story. It's a painful one to tell, but it's certainly one that I know is patterned and I know other people have experienced, and I know social forces played a role in all of that. It's not just the individual biography that I'm telling you. I really do believe it's part of the beginning of another story, and that story is about the challenge of moving collectively together, and not alone and not isolated by capitalism or racism or patriarchy, towards something that's transformative. And that's why I'm here, and that's what I try and do as a professor.
Fortunately, I had mentors that I met along the way. And so, for example, when I was a father at 15, there was someone who really took interest in me and recognized what I could be and not looking at where I presently was. And so that helped me to think. I'm roughly around 18, 19 years old at this time. And I ended up becoming a manager at McDonald's and a manager at Walmart at the same time. And I did that for about a year and a half. And this one of the mentors came to me and really had a kind of sit down with me and talk like, look, you can continue to work these jobs or you can go back to school. And here is the reason why school may be a better opportunity than what you're doing now. And when he did that, it really pushed me to think about the world in these new ways. And so when I went back to school, I actually was trying to like be a truck driver or mortician or any type of trade. And then a professor was like, no, like you need to be on the academic track. Like I can tell that you should be on the academic track. So I listened. I ended up majoring in English education. I wanted to be an English teacher. Then another professor was like, well, you need to, don't stop here, go to the university. It's like, well, okay. And then I ended up applying to Mississippi State, got into Mississippi State. By my senior year, I took an inequalities class. And that's when my world changed, because part of being a sociologist, I didn't know at the time, but what it was doing for me was connecting my biography with history, right? And so in that class really had me to think about my own biography in a new way. So when you understand my hometown, the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, the history of lack of economic investment post the civil rights movement, then I started to understand that the world was much more complex and nuanced than just having family and friends who were lazy, right? And so that class then pushed me to think about my new perspective, so much so that that professor encouraged me to go to graduate school. And then in graduate school, my life changed. And so not only were people helping me along the way, but also my perspective started to shift because I was able to contextualize my own biography, right? You know, people encouraging me to not just stop at the master's degree, but I needed to get a PhD. And remember, I'm first generation. I come up, you know, project housing, single mother family. So a lot of things were new to me. I mean, even filling out the FAFSA form, right? It's a challenge. And these professors were encouraging me to go to grad school. Like, what is that, right? And so people helped me, professors helped me along the way to sit my own experience, my lived experience in a larger historical context and say, oh, that's why things were a challenge. And what's most important here is that I wasn't the only one, right? And so part of sociology is, although you may have a personal biography, that biography can then map onto other person's biographies as well. And now it becomes less about an individual and more about group-based inequality, right? So although I grew up in Mississippi experiencing inequities, I know folks now who California, Maine, Nebraska, Florida, who all have similar experiences I do, and the same underlying mechanisms that was a challenge for my family was some of the same ones that was a challenge to other families as well. So sociology created a context for me to understand myself. And then that put me on a course of being Dr. Williams today. And so I teach sociology and really challenge students to think about their own biographies within a greater, larger societal context.
I worked with a construction company that was working on a very expensive house. I worked on that house for 6 months. The last 4 months were 12 hours a day, 7 days a week with no breaks. And then the moment came that that company didn't have work in the middle of winter. So again, I had that reservoir, that legacy of being middle class without having necessarily the skills at that time, because I had the path laid out because that was the expectations of the white middle class immigrant family. So I went ahead and did get into Colorado State, and I got very lucky. I had learned how to work hard. I also at that time came into contact with a group of activists who were actively working against the United States intervention in various Central American countries that were beginning to contest their politics, their society, their economics that had been in place before. My life became newly defined by twin passions: studying political change and being a part of it. When I received my master's in sociology, I felt like I needed to see some of these struggles firsthand. So I went down to Nicaragua and used these skills as a builder, building houses in a nation that has for decades been one of the two poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere, second only to Haiti. And so I worked on a collective farm. I worked building houses, and again, I learned more about the differences of race and class and gender, but also firsthand experiencing international inequality in a way that I knew only from books before. I worked a couple more years as a construction worker, still not quite understanding that I could actually make a living from that new middle class existence, and then went back to graduate school, this time at the University of California, Davis. My wife was working, and so here too was a difference. A graduate student life is often a pretty poverty-stricken life, but my wife was working, and so we actually were able to enjoy our lives in a way that was quite different. So again, I continued my interest in Latin America, and this time Mexico. And I went down to Guadalajara, Mexico to do field work on a community organization that was representing a community that didn't have sidewalks, it didn't have electric power, it didn't have potable water, it didn't have sewage. Again, I studied an organization who was representing those workers in their political struggle to attain those things and against a deeply anti-democratic government. So once again, I came home impressed with the nobility of this struggle, passionate about understanding those struggles and participating in struggles on my side of the border, but also once again, understanding the differences in groups, understanding the different experiences of working class and poor versus middle class, of race, of international inequality. So I came back and graduated finally, went to work for a couple years at Tulane University, and then came to work at the University of Tennessee, continuing to be interested in these same kinds of issues, not always internationally defined, but struggles for justice for people whose lives are defined by their very, very different backgrounds. And so when I think about this story, the difference is it's all about me as a member of groups, but also in contrast to those in other groups who may have had much the same experience as I did, but not being defined in the same way as this white middle class troubled guy who, if he just gets his trouble taken care of, he's going to succeed. Instead, many of the same people that I knew from that time did not have that privilege, did not have that support.
So in each of the stories that my colleagues just told, people, I think you'll agree, work extremely hard. The storytellers, my colleagues, worked hard in their lives, and ultimately they arrived at this rather comfortable, meaningful professional life. But hard work was not enough. Those three storytellers hone our attention also on secondary characters in the stories who also worked hard but didn't succeed, parents and grandparents and others. And that also makes us think, well, context must be very important. So let me talk a bit about each of the stories. Now, Dr. Michelle Brown's stories expose in various ways how much conditions shape people's lives. Her mother gets cancer, and it's the situation of being uninsured that produces the financial, economic, and relationship harm involved. Poverty, sexism, and racism shape experiences in subtle ways. In Dr. Dedrick Williams' story, he takes a social inequalities college course, which leads him to recognize the fallacy of that American story. Just work hard, just be a strong person and you'll succeed. His family and friends were poor because of obstacles, patterned obstacles of injustice, and not because they weren't hardworking or because they lacked the will. That's what he was socialized to think, that, and I'm going to quote, they were lazy, they didn't want anything out of life. That was an earlier idea, but he came to recognize that those ideas were wrong. And I'd point out also, keep the obstacles in place, keep the status quo. Dr. Scheffner came to understand the privileges that he had as a white American middle-class teenager, the chances multiply he was given after chronic substance abuse from a very early teen age, and also truancy. Later, his work as a laborer at the utter mercy of market forces in the United States, and then even later his research and his activism in Latin America honed that understanding, really crystallized it. Again, and especially we see in Dr. Scheffner's story, history has a very large role to play in both those personal experiences, both the privileges and then the later marginalization as a worker. Clearly, what we see in my colleagues, and I'm so proud to know them, is a lot of determination, a lot of drive, and the hard work. But we also see how much their lives were conditioned and constrained by forces completely outside of their control. So to wrap up, I find that their stories really make us think in a robust way about the sociological imagination, and they challenge what we take to be the real story of our lives.